Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 8. Developments. Tally and Alder hadn't talked much after this. Instead, they had simply sat together on the couch in silence. It hadn't been an uncomfortable silence, though. The atmosphere had been relaxed, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But with a heavy weight lift from their shoulders and another wall torn down between them. Soon, however, the quiet had been interrupted by Tally's phone. She had received a text from Rael, informing her that Abigail had called to tell her she would be home soon, and had sounded pretty tired and upset. Tally had immediately gotten up from the couch, and that had somehow put an end to their silent banter. Tally had only managed to mumble a quiet apology, not wanting to drag Abigail's emotional state into this. The whole situation had been pretty awkward. Still, Alder had simply nodded and wordlessly accompanied her to the door. They both had hesitated for a moment, then, not quite sure what to do, or how to say goodbye. For a split second, Tally had considered just pulling Alder into another quick hug, but the way her partner had been standing in the door, arms crossed in front of her body, had been pretty discouraging. So she had instead gone for a simple, clumsy wave of her hand that Alder had returned with a stiff smile. From the outside, nobody would have been able to guess that Alder had been lying in Tally's arms only minutes before that rather tense exchange. Alder had appeared quite distant again, but Tally had known better than to take it personally. She had been so open only minutes before, so vulnerable, and her honesty had probably surprised her just as much as Tally. It was more than understandable that she needed some time and space to process everything, and honestly, so did Tally. When she had arrived home, however, her own problems had quickly been put to the back of her head. Abigail had arrived only minutes before her, and Tally had found her in the hallway, busy snapping at Rael for something absolutely pointless. Her whole body had looked tense, her expression blank, completely bare of any emotion. Tally had wordlessly pulled her in a tight hug before she had even put off her shoes, and Abigail had started to sob as soon as Tally had wrapped her arms around her. Abigail would definitely deny this, but when it came to showing emotions, she and Alder were actually pretty similar. In a way, her friendship with Abigail had prepared Tally perfectly for every single one of Alder's mood swings, and had made it easier to give Alder the space she needed. They both always appear very hard on the outside, desperately trying not to show weakness, to keep a perfectly controlled image up. Still, they were big softies on the inside, quietly fighting their own battles, bottling every emotion up until, at some point, they would explode. By now, both Tally and Rael knew how to handle Abigail's outbursts, even though Rael was sometimes struggling not to take them personally. So, while Tally always tried to resolve situations calmly, Rael instead always went in head first, offering Abigail an outlet for her emotions by giving her something to yell about. Tally could only imagine how hard the day must have been for Abigail. Up until that point, Tally never had to tell the family of a victim that their loved one would never return to them. Listening to Abigail's experience alone had almost brought her to tears. Tanya Flynn's family had been devastated. Her husband had broken down as soon as Abigail and Anacostia had introduced themselves. Their 3-year-old son just couldn't understand what was going on, when he had finally calmed down enough to tell him that his mommy wouldn't come home anymore. It had been a lot, and Abigail had done her best to comfort the two, to make sure they had everything they needed, but had barely been able to stay professional and push away her own grief and anger. Tally and Riel had been doing their best to calm her down, and had spent the rest of the night cuddled together on the couch, watching reruns of Queer Eye and drinking hot cocoa. They had avoided anything work-related, knowing that the next morning would bring back all the death and horrors sooner rather than later, making it impossible to ignore just what a terrible place this world had become. On the next morning, things at the Boston Police Department seemed completely normal, at least for an outsider. But at a closer look, the atmosphere was tense. There was no random chit-chat, no energized good morning shouts, no silent laughter. Instead, the rooms were filled with hushed voices and serious faces. Generally, everybody just seemed to be the slightest bit more on edge than usual. This also included Tally. For the first time in her life, she had actually dreaded going to work. She didn't know what to expect and definitely wasn't ready to face the facts that the Camarilla killer was really back. She was glad to see Alder already sitting at her usual place behind her desk. It gave her a certain sense of normality, something that she could hold on to. However, before she could walk over to greet her partner, she spotted Detective Batan, sitting at one of the spare desks. She tried her best to ignore the other detective, but couldn't resist rolling her eyes when she blew an overdramatic kiss in Tally's direction as soon as she saw her. Tally had planned to avoid Batan at all costs. Captain Bellwether, however, had other plans when she entered the bullpen and announced that the usual morning briefing would be pushed back, and instead asked Tally, Alder, and Batan to join her in her office. Being in a room with both Alder and Batan was tense. She would have expected the two to be at each other's throats as soon as they laid eyes on each other. She would have been able to deal with that, but instead of arguments and constant bickering, Alder and Batan just didn't talk with each other at all. They completely ignored the presence of each other, and only ever addressed Tally or Captain Bellwether directly. Still, Tally could feel the tension between them, could see the deathly glares that they were sending at each other's back. Working with these two was definitely going to be a slippery slope. All it needed was a tiny spark and one wrong word and one wrong decision, and the powder keg between them would explode. Tally just hoped that they would be professional enough to have each other's back when it counted, and that she wouldn't get in the crossfire. Tally felt like some sort of human buffer when she was sitting on her chair between the two women and listened to Captain Bellwether explaining their approach to the case once more. Batan would join their team to investigate the Camarilla killer. Also, she would officially be named the leading detective of the case. This would also mean that she would be at the center of the media interest. She would be going to press conferences and make public announcements. In addition to that, Isadora would be rejoining the team as well. She had already performed the autopsies of the previous victims, so everybody had agreed it would be best if she would support Scylla with the latest victim. Both Tally and Alder would take part in all the important steps of the investigation that was happening away from the public eye. They would join Batan in interrogations, would follow new leads together, and would be kept up to date with any developments the entire time. But they would keep themselves in the background, away from all the turmoil, and hopefully away from the Camarilla killer's prying eyes. It was impossible to hide Alder's involvement completely, so this was their best shot. Tally could see how much Alder was struggling with all of this, how hard it was to give up the control she had over this case. Her lips were pressed together to a thin line, and she sent death glares towards Batan whenever she opened her mouth to speak. Batan certainly wouldn't have been Alder's first choice for the job, and Tally was definitely with her on this one. Still, she was their only option. The only one capable and reckless enough to put herself willingly in the crossfire, and she wouldn't let anyone stop her from doing just that. After ensuring once more that everybody was aware of the sensibility and importance of the case, and sending a couple of warning glances towards Alder and Batan, Captain Bellwether ultimately ended their meeting and told the three detectives to go back to work. Tally, however, wasn't ready to follow her order just yet. Instead, she remained in her seat and cleared her throat. Captain Bellwether's head turned in her direction. "Yes, Detective Craven?" "Actually, there's something else I'd like to discuss with you if you have a minute." She hated herself for the way her voice started to shake at her words. She knew she had every reason to report Garrett for what he did to her. He could call himself lucky that she had waited, and was now speaking with the captain alone, rather than informing her directly afterwards in front of the entire department. Still, standing up for herself was way harder than she had expected. Captain Bellwether looked at her curiously, but then nodded. If she had noticed Tally's insecurity, she didn't let it show, something that Tally was very grateful for. The captain then turned her attention towards Alder and Patan. "Detectives, would you mind leaving us alone?" "Yes, ma'am," Detective Patan saluted mockingly, which got her another disapproving glare from both Bellwether and Alder, but then got up from her chair and moved towards the door without further discussion. Detective Alder stood up from her chair as well. She looked at Tally, slowly turning towards her. Tally could see the hesitation in her movement, but then her partner reached out and gently touched her upper arm with her hand. It was only the briefest of touch, but the warmth that Alder was radiating immediately made Tally shiver. She hadn't had the chance to tell her that she had decided to report Garrett, but it seemed like she didn't even have to. Alder noticed her agitation and was trying her best to comfort her. Tally turned her head to get a better look at her. Concern was written all over Alder's face, and when she raised her eyebrows in question, her unspoken words were dangling in the air between them. "Do you want me to stay?" Tally actually considered her silent offer for a moment. She felt more comfortable when Alder was around her, that was for sure, but she felt like this was something she needed to do on her own. Plus, she could see Detective Patan still lingering in the doorframe, eyes directed at Alder's hand on Tally's arm, a knowing smirk on her face. Nope, she would not add even more fuel to that fire. This was her own battle, and she wouldn't ask anyone to fight it for her. So, she only smiled at Alder warmly, hoping it would bring across how much she still appreciated her support, but then slowly shook her head and wordlessly mouthed, "I'm fine," in her direction. Alder returned her smile immediately. Her eyes were filled with understanding, and maybe even a little bit of pride. And oh, Tally could feel herself getting lost in those incredibly blue eyes once more. It was as if something was drawing her towards them, making it impossible to look away. So she didn't. An amused cough from the door finally made her snap out of it. "Gotta send help. I think I somehow got trapped in a sappy romance movie, and I can't get out." Alder didn't even flinch at Detective Patan's comment, but Tally felt her cheeks heating up. She really needed to work on her poker face, or there would simply be no way she'd survive working with the detective. Well, she also definitely needed to work on the fact that she seemed to forget everything and everyone around her whenever she was interacting with Alder. But, baby steps. Alder squeezed her arm once more, then finally turned around, shooed Detective Patan out of the room, and closed the door behind him, leaving Tally alone with Captain Bellwether. "So, Detective Craven, what is it you would like to discuss with me?" Tally was surprised to actually hear the concern in Captain Bellwether's voice. Apparently, Alder's silent offer for support hadn't gone completely unnoticed, and she had understood that Tally was dealing with something serious. So far, Tally had only gotten to know her captain as an incredibly professional and collected woman, but it seemed that Alder might actually be right. Maybe she and Abigail weren't so different after all. Tally took one last deep breath and did her best to stop herself from overthinking everything yet again, then started to explain what had happened to her at the ball. In the beginning, her voice was shaky and quiet, but with each word leaving her mouth, she got more confident. It was the first time she actually recalled the whole incident out loud. It somehow made the whole incident more real, made her realize just how fucked up all of this was, and that it was right for her to act, instead of simply staying silent. Captain Bellwether didn't interrupt her and just listened attentively. She was trying her best to keep her face expressionless, but once Tally had finished, her eyes were filled with anger, and her lips were pressed together into a thin line. Tally knew that anger was in no way directed against her. Still, she suddenly felt the need to apologize. "I'm sorry, I probably should have dealt with him directly instead of taking this to you. You already have enough on your plate and—" Captain Bellwether raised her hand to interrupt her. "No, you better stop right there, Detective Craven. Tally." Her voice softened a bit when she switched to Tally's first name. You did absolutely nothing wrong. I am so sorry that something like this has happened to you. And it pains me even more that someone from my own department would do something like this to you. Believe me when I tell you that I am so glad you had the courage to talk to me about it. I'm going to make sure that this asshole Detective Buttonwood will not be able to bother you, or anyone else at this department ever again. I've had my eyes on him for a while now. I suspected things, but couldn't do much without any of his victims speaking up. He absolutely deserves what is coming for him. The amount of relief she felt at Captain Bellwether's words surprised Tally. She had thought that she was doing just fine, that she might even feel a bit sorry for Garrett. She didn't. What exactly is coming for him? From the official side, there will be several disciplinary measures. He will need a transfer to another department if he even finds one that wants to take him. From the unofficial side, well, let's just say for his sake, I really hope he won't find another department around here, because most detectives are not taking sexual harassment at the workplace lightly, and they will definitely let him know. Captain Bellwether's words sounded harsh, but Tally felt strangely satisfied hearing them. Garrett assaulted her, shamelessly took advantage of the fact that she had been drunk and disoriented, and he probably would have done even more if Alder hadn't interrupted him. She repeated Captain Bellwether's words in her head, and a grim smile appeared on her face. He absolutely deserves what is coming for him. Thank you. You don't need to thank me. Thank you for your courage to speak up. Tally simply nodded in response and then got up. She was already halfway through Captain Bellwether's office when the woman started to speak once more. Oh, and Craven, one more thing. Tally turned around again, looking at Captain Bellwether expectantly. I didn't want to say anything in front of Detective Bataan and Detective Alder earlier, but I still want to make it clear that I wouldn't have assigned you to this case if I didn't believe you could handle it. I am not going to lie to you. Working with Alder and Bataan on a case like this is probably going to be one of the biggest challenges you will ever face in your career. You're still so young and inexperienced, and I didn't mean it as an insult. But you are gifted, Detective Craven, and I think you are exactly what this case needs. Captain Bellwether's words sounded genuine, and for a second, Tally was slightly overwhelmed with them. This was the second time that somebody had called her gifted, after only 2 months of working on this job. She appreciated the compliment, she really did, yet she didn't see it. She was just Tally, and right now she wasn't even sure if that would be enough. But the captain's office was definitely not a place to have a breakdown over this, so Tally simply shrugged her shoulders. Well, if you say so. You don't believe me. It was a statement rather than a question, and it was absolutely correct. Reading Tally like an open book really seemed to be a Bellwether thing. Captain Bellwether didn't wait for Tally to respond to her. Instead, she looked at her intensely and continued talking. Do you know how many partners Detective Alder had in the last year? Tally shook her head. 8. All of them intelligent people, competent people. People that were perfectly suitable for the job. Yet none of them lasted longer than a month, because at some point, Alder had either scared them away with her constant attitude or had simply refused to work with them without even stating specific reasons. And then you arrived, and managed to piss her off even before you were officially introduced. Tally smiled softly at the memories. She couldn't believe this had only happened a little more than 2 months ago. It felt like years had passed. But you stayed. More even. You two actually seemed to work well together. You solved cases. You even managed to stand up to Sarah. You dare to criticize her, and it doesn't result in her immediately attempting to kill you, which is quite impressive considering Sarah's track record. You did all this simply by yourself. You seem to have a good influence on Sarah, so please stop talking yourself down and simply accept the compliment. A pep talk from Captain Bellwether was not exactly what Tally had expected to happen today. Still, it did its job and did wonders for Tally's self-confidence. She couldn't stop a wide grin from spreading all over her face. She also has a good influence on me. Shit, Tally bit her tongue. She hadn't meant to say this out loud. For a split second she had hoped that Captain Bellwether hadn't heard it, but then she heard the other woman chuckle slightly. So it seems. Her voice turned serious again after this. Just keep in mind that she is a complicated woman, Craven. Be careful that you're not getting burned. Tally could barely stop herself from rolling her eyes at her captain, not because of what she said, but because of the fact that these had been the exact words that Abigail had said to her right before her first day at the department. Like mother, like daughter, it seemed. She reached for the door once more. Don't worry. I know I'm anything but fireproof. Captain Bellwether dismissed her with one last curt nod, and Tally opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Once she heard the door closing behind her, she let out a breath she didn't even know she was holding. Whew, that was truly a lot to process for her already overwhelmed head. The fact that even Captain Bellwether seemed to notice a certain level of trust between her and Alder was concerning, but at the same time also flattering. She wouldn't have imagined Petra Bellwether as someone this observant. Well, truth be told, it probably came with the job. Still, Tally realized once more that she would need to be more careful about showing how much Alder's presence was affecting her when other people were around. The last thing she wanted was to cause any rumors or speculations about something between them that was only happening in her head anyway. Tally was still walking towards the bullpen, lost in her own thoughts. She was just passing the kitchen when she heard voices from inside. Voices she recognized all too well. Tally stopped. She usually wasn't a fan of eavesdropping, but she just couldn't help herself. After not talking to each other all morning, and goddess knows for how long before that, Sarah Alder and Nick de Batan were now standing in one room together, without murdering each other, and seemed to be having an actual conversation. Groundbreaking. She really didn't want to be so sneaky, but a girl's gotta do what a girl's gotta do. So, Tally paused in her movement and leaned against the wall right next to the door. She took her phone out of her pocket, started typing a really long and really important message she would never send, and tried to focus on what was going on inside the kitchen. In case someone would become suspicious, she would simply say it was just for Alder's and Batan's protection. She would save Alder. Or Batan. Honestly, she couldn't even know who needed saving more when things would have actually escalated between them. Finally, she could make out Batan's teasing voice through the door. She's cute, you know, Red. Whatever she had expected about the conversation, she definitely had not planned to be the topic of it. Her cheeks reddened, and she really should have walked away. But it was like one of these embarrassing reality shows that Riel kept obsessing over. You couldn't just turn it off, no matter how much it made you cringe. Batan, I'm working. No, actually, you're making coffee. Tally could literally hear Alder rolling her eyes at the former partner. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Don't try to distract me, Sarah. You know that won't work. Never has. So what about you and Red? She got you good, huh? Don't even go there. She is my partner, period. Also, she has a name. Alder's voice has turned dangerously low, and everybody who would walk in on her being in a mood like that would know better, would simply turn around, or at least change the topic of the conversation. Oh, I know that, but I prefer Red, and I think she likes it. Would probably like it more when it would be coming from your mouth. Yeah, bet she would enjoy it coming from your mouth quite a bit. Well, Detective Batan certainly wasn't everybody, and Tally almost choked in an attempt to conceal the gasp that had just escaped her mouth. Batan, I'm warning you, don't even go there. Tally could hear a cup being placed on the counter with so much force that it was a wonder it didn't break. Alder was now almost hissing through gritted teeth. Tally had never heard her talk like this, and it should probably make her feel uncomfortable at least, but what she felt was actually quite the contrary. Alder's voice was vibrating through the walls, each of her words sending a slight shiver through her body that went right into her core. She closed her eyes. God damn it. Go where? Red Spannies? Or pointing out that she has the hots for you? Stay away from her. Jealous, I see. You see nothing. Well, I definitely just saw her basically undressing you with her eyes right in front of Petra, and you didn't exactly complain about it. But if you would call the way she looks at you nothing, then sure, I saw absolutely nothing. Batan chuckled, way too amused by her own jokes. Alder, however, wasn't amused in the slightest and let out a rather frustrated huff. Look, I don't owe you any explanation, and honestly, don't even know why I'm talking to you about this. Whatever your head is imagining here, it's simply not there. It ain't gonna happen, okay? Me and Craven, we ain't gonna happen. End of discussion. We have a case to focus on, and I would appreciate it very much if you would take this seriously for once. I would very much appreciate it if you wouldn't take anything so serious for once, and trust me, you would too. Oh, because trusting you had worked out so well the last time? Stop acting as if you know me, okay? That time is long over. See, Sarah, this is where you are wrong. I don't think there even was a time where I truly knew you. The bitterness in Batan's voice surprised Tally. This was the first time she heard the detective show any sort of genuine emotion, other than her sarcasm, which seemed to be her personal defense mechanism. No. Actually, I think that's something we can agree on. Let me just say it one more time, just to be clear. Stay out of my business. There's nothing going on between me and Craven, and there never will be. Tally could hear someone forcefully closing one of the cabinets. Then steps were moving in the direction of the door, right next to which Tally was still leaning against a wall. She was grateful for her body acting faster than her head for once. Within seconds, she had pushed herself off the wall and was hurrying down the hallway, away from the kitchen. If she would have lingered for a moment longer, she would have seen Alder pushing the door open and stepping into the hallway, and more importantly, she would have seen the tired and resigned look on her face, and might have even heard her barely audibly whisper, "No matter how much I want to." But of course, Tally didn't catch that, and instead walked into the bullpen, her thoughts spiraling. She sat down behind her desk and barely registered Captain Bellwether entering the room, gathering everyone around her to start her briefing. Alder was walking in right behind her and walked quietly to her own desk, sitting down without even glancing in Tally's direction. Tally forced herself to sit up straight, to keep her eyes focused on Captain Bellwether and not let them wander towards Alder. She did her best to follow the words of her captain, but once she realized it was a slightly less detailed version of the talk she just had with Alder and Batan, plus an official introduction of Detective Batan and Isadora, could feel her thoughts drifting away again. The conversation between Alder and Batan had stirred her up, way more than she cared to admit. She had felt a pang of disappointment in her chest at Alder's last words. The worst thing about that was that she couldn't even explain why. It was not like she had expected anything to happen between them. She wasn't even sure yet how to interpret her own feelings about the older woman, and she didn't expect her to return any of the messy emotions that were currently causing her to stop thinking straight whenever she was around. Stop thinking straight. Goddess, how ironic. Tally had to admit. She might have gotten her hopes up, might have allowed her thoughts to wander every now and then, letting it make up some sort of fantasy when Alder had started to open up more towards her. There had been this spark between them that had just been waiting to be turned into something bigger. But maybe it was better to nip this spark in the bud before it would turn into flames, which would end up burning them down completely. Alder had made it clear. There was nothing happening between her and Tally. Not now, not ever. They had a case to focus on, and neither of them couldn't afford any distractions. So, she would force herself to stay professional when Alder was around. She wasn't quite sure yet how she should explain that to her traitorous body, but it needed to happen. She would distance herself if necessary, making sure that Alder wouldn't catch her off guard. Determined to put her plan into action immediately, Tally walked over to Abigail as soon as Captain Bellwether had ended her briefing. To gather with her, she wanted to go over the statement of Tanya Flynn's family. "Shall we?" Tally asked her, maybe a little too brightly. "Okay, but how do you actually manage to sound excited about paperwork?" The laugh Abigail gave her was slightly strained, and her eyes looked tired. Tally knew that she was playing it tough, trying to conceal how much she was struggling with the events from yesterday. So she had volunteered to support her with the paperwork. She hoped that having a familiar face around would make it easier for Abigail, and she was right. The two women worked quite efficiently together. Together, they tried to get an overview of the kind of woman Tanya Flynn had been. They started by collecting all the information about her life that they could find. Tanya Flynn had started to work as a freelance journalist a little over 2 years ago. Her husband had told Abigail that she had worked for several newspapers and networks before, but just hadn't been very good at following the rather strict rules at these places. He had described her as ambitious and determined, a woman who had had no problems with standing up for herself and voicing her opinion, no matter how controversial it had been. Still, she had been a loving mother and had always prioritized their son over everything work-related. In the end, Telly felt like she had gotten a pretty good impression of Tanya Flynn. However, this didn't seem to bring them any closer to catching the Camarilla killer. There was no obvious connection to any of the other women, no reason why the Camarilla killer had chosen her to return from his retirement, other than the fact that she had been the reason that Detective Alder had broken their agreement, an agreement barely anybody was officially allowed to know about. Telly groaned. Why did this have to be so messed up? She was so focused on reading the file that was currently lying in front of her that she didn't realize how someone was walking up behind her. She didn't turn around, not even when the person was leaning down slightly and moved even closer. Then her nostrils caught the smallest hint of Alder's perfume in the air, and Telly immediately tensed up. Her body shivered. Professional behavior, Craven. She forced herself to keep her breath even, eyes still focused on the file. Then she could feel a light touch on her shoulder, long, slender fingers gently gripping it. Telly automatically leaned into it. Professional She could feel Alder leaning down even further, could feel her nose touching her hair, lips only inches away from her ear. Her breath hitched, and she closed her eyes. Goddess! Her body was useless, completely useless. Meet me after the shift at the elevator. No more secrets, remember? The husky sound of Alder's whisper did absolutely nothing to ease Telly's struggle. But then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, and at the same time just not long enough, Alder pulled away, giving Telly the space she so desperately wanted. Okay, maybe not so desperately. Sure, she did her best to sound confident. She failed. Alder didn't respond. Instead, Telly could hear her walking back to her desk while she was desperately trying to keep her cheeks from blushing. Now, what was all that about? Abigail nudged her slightly, eyes curiously switching between Alder, now back at her desk, and Batan, who of course just had to see this exchange, and was now raising her eyebrows at Telly suggestively. Telly rolled her eyes, ignoring the teasing grin that had appeared on Abigail's face. I guess this is just my life now. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.